Some secrets are buried so deep that even those closest to us never suspect they exist. For 23 years, Sarah Martinez lived with a silence that ate away at her soul, carrying wounds that no one could see. She had perfected the art of hiding her pain behind bright smiles and busy schedules, fooling everyone around her into believing she was just another successful young woman navigating life. But trauma has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, and sometimes it takes a stranger with the right training to recognize what family and friends have missed for decades. This is the story of how one Navy SEAL corpsman's keen observation during a routine medical emergency would uncover a devastating truth that had been hidden in plain sight, shocking an entire community and forever changing the lives of everyone involved. Part 1. The emergency call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in March, piercing through the quiet streets of Oceanside, California. Sarah Martinez had collapsed during her shift at the late-night diner where she worked part-time while finishing her nursing degree. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but what should have been a routine medical response would become the catalyst that unraveled a carefully constructed life built on silence and survival. Sarah had been wiping down tables in the nearly empty diner when the dizzy spell hit her. One moment she was thinking about her upcoming final exams, and the next, the black and white checkered floor was rushing toward her face. Her coworker Jenny screamed as Sarah's body crumpled behind the counter, her head striking the edge of a metal shelf on the way down. The paramedics who responded were a seasoned team. Mike Rodriguez had been running emergency calls for 8 years, while his partner, Lisa Chen, was relatively new but thorough in her assessments. However, it was the third member of their crew that night who would make all the difference. Petty Officer First Class David Thompson, a Navy SEAL corpsman on a cross-training rotation with the local emergency services, had seen more trauma in his 6 years of military service than most medical professionals see in a lifetime. As they loaded Sarah into the ambulance, Thompson noticed something that his civilian counterparts missed. While Rodriguez focused on her vitals and Chen started an IV line, Thompson's trained eye caught subtle details that set off alarm bells in his mind. Sarah's reaction to being touched, even while semi-conscious, was telling. Her body tensed in specific ways, and she exhibited defensive postures that spoke of deep-seated trauma responses. Her pupils are reactive. Blood pressure is stabilizing. Rodriguez called out as they raced toward Oceanside General Hospital. But Thompson was studying Sarah's face, watching how she flinched when anyone moved too quickly near her, how her breathing changed when male voices spoke too close to her ear. These weren't the reactions of someone simply dealing with a medical emergency. These were the responses of someone whose body remembered danger, even in an unconscious state. At the hospital, Dr. Jennifer Walsh took over Sarah's care. The initial diagnosis seemed straightforward: exhaustion, dehydration, and a mild concussion from the fall. Sarah had been working 2 jobs while maintaining a full course load at the community college, and her body had simply given out. It was a story the medical staff heard often from young adults trying to make ends meet in expensive Southern California. Sarah regained consciousness about an hour after arriving at the hospital. She was polite, apologetic for causing a fuss, and insisted she felt much better. She answered all the standard questions correctly, showed no signs of serious neurological damage, and seemed eager to go home. To most of the staff, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed, an overworked student who had pushed herself too hard. But Thompson lingered. Something about Sarah's demeanor continued to trouble him. During his deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, he had worked with local women who had survived unspeakable trauma. He had learned to recognize the subtle signs that others often missed, the way someone's eyes would dart toward exits, how they positioned their body to maintain maximum distance from potential threats, the particular quality of hypervigilance that never fully disappears, even years after traumatic events. When Dr. Walsh stepped out to review Sarah's test results, Thompson approached her bed. He introduced himself and explained his military medical background, speaking in the calm, non-threatening tone he had perfected when dealing with trauma victims overseas. "Sarah, I know you're probably tired and want to get home," he began. "But I want you to know that sometimes our bodies react to stress in ways that can tell us important things about our health. Have you been experiencing any unusual anxiety lately? Trouble sleeping? Nightmares?" Sarah's response was immediate and telling. Her entire body stiffened, her breathing became shallow, and her eyes took on the flat, distant look that Thompson had seen countless times before. She mumbled something about being fine, about just needing to eat better and get more sleep, but her hands were shaking now, and she kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Thompson made a decision that would prove pivotal. Instead of pushing further, he simply said, "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happened to you, whatever you've been carrying, it's not your fault. And when you're ready to talk about it, there are people trained to help, people who will believe you." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Years of buried emotion began to surface as tears streamed down her face. She looked at Thompson with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, as if he had somehow seen through walls she had spent decades building. "How did you know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did you know something was wrong?" Thompson pulled a chair closer to her bed, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring she felt heard. "Your body knows," he explained gently. "Even when our minds try to forget or move past trauma, our bodies remember. The way you respond to touch, to sudden movements, to male voices, these are protective mechanisms. They develop to keep you safe from something." For the next 30 minutes, as the hospital bustled around them, Sarah began to share pieces of a story she had never told anyone completely. It came out in fragments, interrupted by long pauses and floods of tears. But Thompson listened with the patience of someone who understood that healing often begins with simply being heard. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Nevada, the youngest of 3 children, in what appeared to be a picture-perfect family. Her father, Robert Martinez, was a respected high school principal. Her mother, Maria, taught kindergarten at the elementary school. They were active in their church, hosted community barbecues, and were the kind of family that others looked up to and envied. But behind closed doors, Robert Martinez was a predator. The abuse had started when Sarah was 8 years old, beginning with inappropriate touching that gradually escalated over the years. He was careful, calculating, and expert at manipulation. He convinced Sarah that she was special, that their secret was something that proved his love for her. When she grew older and began to understand that what was happening was wrong, he shifted tactics, threatening her younger cousins, warning that speaking out would destroy the family and hurt people she loved. The abuse continued until Sarah left for college at 18. She had chosen a school as far from home as possible, telling her family she wanted to study marine biology, and California had the best programs. In reality, she simply needed to put distance between herself and her father. She threw herself into her studies, changed her major to nursing when marine biology felt too isolating, and built a life based on helping others heal, even as her own wounds remained unaddressed. For 5 years, Sarah had convinced herself that moving away had solved the problem. She rarely went home, claiming school and work kept her too busy. She maintained contact with her mother and siblings through brief phone calls and carefully composed emails. She thought she had successfully escaped her past and could build a future uncontaminated by her childhood trauma. But trauma doesn't simply disappear because we change our zip code. Sarah's body had been keeping score, storing the stress and fear in ways that were now beginning to manifest. The exhaustion that led to her collapse wasn't just from overwork. It was the cumulative effect of years of hypervigilance, of constantly scanning for threats, of sleeping poorly and startling at unexpected sounds. Her immune system was compromised, her digestive system was in constant turmoil, and her nervous system was stuck in a perpetual state of fight-or-flight activation. As Sarah shared her story with Thompson, she began to understand that her physical symptoms weren't separate from her emotional trauma. The chronic headaches, the difficulty concentrating, the inexplicable anxiety attacks that she had attributed to school stress. All of these were her body's way of processing unresolved trauma. Thompson listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly providing the safe space Sarah needed to begin acknowledging her truth. When she finished speaking, he explained that what she had experienced had a name: complex childhood sexual abuse. He assured her that her reactions were normal responses to abnormal circumstances, and that healing was possible with the right support. "Sarah, you've been incredibly strong," Thompson told her. "Surviving what you survived, building a life for yourself, pursuing a career where you help others heal, that takes tremendous courage. But you don't have to carry this alone anymore. There are specialized therapists who understand trauma like yours. There are support groups of other survivors, and there are legal options if you choose to pursue them." The mention of legal options caused Sarah to panic. She had spent so many years protecting her family's reputation, worrying about her mother's reaction, fearing that no one would believe her against her respected father. The idea of public exposure terrified her. Thompson recognized her fear and spoke carefully. "Sarah, Any decisions about what to do with this information are entirely yours. But I want you to understand that keeping secrets to protect other people often ends up protecting the person who caused the harm. Your father's reputation isn't more important than your healing, and there might be other victims who could benefit from your courage. This last statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. In all her years of carrying this secret, she had never seriously considered that her father might have hurt other children. She had convinced herself that she was an isolated victim, that her father's behavior was somehow specific to her. The possibility that her silence might have enabled him to harm others introduced a new dimension of guilt and responsibility that felt overwhelming. Dr. Walsh returned to check on Sarah's condition and was surprised to find her patient in such obvious emotional distress. Thompson briefly explained that Sarah had disclosed experiencing childhood trauma and was dealing with some delayed emotional responses. Walsh, recognizing that this was beyond her area of expertise, asked if Sarah would be willing to speak with the hospital's crisis counselor before being discharged. Sarah agreed, though she felt terrified about taking this step. Everything she had worked to keep buried was now exposed, and she had no idea how to move forward. Thompson stayed with her until the counselor arrived, providing a steady, reassuring presence that helped her feel less alone with her revelation. The crisis counselor, Maria Santos, had 20 years of experience working with trauma survivors. She spent an hour with Sarah, helping her process the immediate emotional impact of her disclosure and developing a safety plan for the coming days. Maria explained that Sarah's physical collapse might have been her body's way of finally demanding attention for wounds that had been ignored too long. As dawn broke over Oceanside, Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital. She felt simultaneously exhausted and strangely lighter, as if a weight she had carried for so long had finally been acknowledged, even if not yet lifted. Thompson gave her his contact information and a number for a specialized trauma treatment center. He also provided information about RAIN, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, and several local support resources. Walking to her car in the hospital parking lot, Sarah felt like she was seeing the world through new eyes. The sunrise seemed brighter, colors more vivid. For the first time in years, she took a full, deep breath without feeling like something was constricting her chest. She realized that this moment, this terrifying, overwhelming, life-changing moment, might actually be the beginning of real healing rather than just survival. But as she drove back to her small apartment, reality began to set in. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her secret was no longer completely her own. Thompson knew, Dr. Walsh knew, the counselor knew, and they had all encouraged her to tell others, to seek additional help, to consider taking action that could potentially expose her entire family to the truth she had worked so hard to hide. The weight of decision-making ahead felt enormous. Should she tell her mother, her siblings? Should she report her father to authorities? Should she seek therapy, knowing that it would mean revisiting memories she had spent years trying to suppress? Each possibility seemed to carry enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. Sarah spent the rest of the day in her apartment, alternating between relief at finally telling someone and terror about what came next. She called in sick to both her jobs, claiming she needed another day to recover from her medical emergency. In reality, she needed time to process what felt like the complete reorganization of her understanding of herself and her life. By evening, Sarah had made one decision. She called the trauma treatment center Thompson had recommended and scheduled an initial consultation. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time since she was 8 years old, Sarah was actively choosing to prioritize her own healing over protecting others from difficult truths. As she fell asleep that night, Sarah's dreams were different than they had been in years. Instead of the familiar nightmares that had plagued her sleep, she dreamed of open doors and bright rooms, of speaking without fear and being believed without question. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but for the first time in decades, she felt like she might be strong enough to face whatever came next. The young woman who would wake up the next morning would be fundamentally different from the one who had collapsed in the diner. Sarah Martinez was about to begin the most difficult and important journey of her life, the journey from victim to survivor to thriver, with all the challenges and revelations that path would bring. The trauma treatment center sat in a quiet corner of downtown Oceanside, housed in a converted Victorian home painted in soothing blues and greens. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early for her appointment, sitting in her car and questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. 3 days had passed since her disclosure to Thompson, and the initial relief she felt had given way to a complex mixture of anxiety, guilt, and something she was afraid to name as hope. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the therapist Sarah would be working with, specialized in complex trauma and had been treating survivors of childhood sexual abuse for over a decade. She had learned that the first session often determined whether a client would continue with treatment or retreat back into silence and avoidance. As Sarah entered her office, Dr. Chen immediately noticed the hypervigilant posture Thompson had described in his referral notes. "Sarah, I want to start by acknowledging how difficult it must have been for you to make this appointment." Chen began, her voice calm and non-threatening. "Many survivors find that taking this step feels both terrifying and necessary. How are you feeling right now, in this moment?" Sarah's response came in fits and starts. She described feeling like she was betraying her family, like she was making too big a deal out of something that happened long ago, like she should be able to handle this on her own. These statements were so common among childhood abuse survivors that Dr. Chen could have predicted them word for word, but she listened, as if hearing them for the first time, understanding that Sarah needed to voice these conflicted feelings. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you experienced wasn't just something that happened long ago," Dr. Chen explained gently. "Childhood trauma, especially ongoing sexual abuse by a trusted family member, creates lasting changes in how our brains and bodies function. It's not something you should have to handle alone, and seeking help isn't a betrayal of anyone except perhaps the person who hurt you." Over the course of that first 90-minute session, Sarah began to understand the scope of how her childhood trauma had shaped her adult life. Dr. Chen explained concepts like complex PTSD, trauma bonds, and somatic manifestations of psychological wounds. For the first time, Sarah began to see patterns in her behavior that she had never connected to her abuse. Her difficulty maintaining romantic relationships suddenly made sense. Sarah had always been attracted to older men who seemed strong and protective, but she invariably sabotaged these relationships before they became too intimate. She would create conflicts, withdraw emotionally, or simply disappear without explanation. She had blamed these patterns on being too busy with school and work, but now she understood they were protective mechanisms developed to avoid the vulnerability that had once made her a target. Her choice of nursing as a career also took on new meaning. Sarah had been drawn to helping others heal, but she consistently chose the most challenging and emotionally demanding positions available. She worked with pediatric patients, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and had planned to specialize in emergency medicine. Dr. Chen suggested that Sarah might be unconsciously trying to save other victims in ways she hadn't been able to save herself as a child. Even Sarah's physical symptoms began to make sense through a trauma-informed lens. The chronic headaches corresponded to periods of high stress or when she was forced to have contact with her family. The digestive issues flared up around holidays when she was expected to return home. The sleep disturbances and hypervigilance were classic symptoms of a nervous system stuck in survival mode. "Sarah, your body has been trying to tell your story for years," Dr. Chen observed. "Now we need to help your mind catch up so you can begin to heal both the psychological and physical wounds you've been carrying." As the session concluded, Dr. Chen gave Sarah several assignments for the coming week. She was to start keeping a daily journal, noting not just events but her emotional and physical responses to different situations. She was also asked to begin practicing basic grounding techniques when she felt overwhelmed or triggered. Most importantly, Dr. Chen asked Sarah to pay attention to her instinctive reactions to people and situations, recognizing these as valuable information rather than character flaws to overcome. The week between Sarah's first and second therapy sessions proved to be one of the most challenging of her life. Armed with new awareness of her trauma responses, she began noticing patterns everywhere. She realized that she always chose seats facing the exit in restaurants, that she became visibly tense when older men spoke to her in casual settings, and that she compulsively overworked herself whenever she felt emotionally vulnerable. But the most difficult revelation came when she was reviewing old family photographs for a class project about personal history. Looking at pictures from her childhood with new eyes, Sarah could see things she had missed or dismissed before. In photo after photo, she stood at a distance from her father, her body language closed and protective even as a young child. Her siblings appeared relaxed and natural in family pictures, but Sarah's smile never reached her eyes, and she seemed to take up as little space as possible. One photograph in particular stopped her cold. It was taken at her 10th birthday party, just 2 years into her father's abuse. In the picture, her father had his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close to him as they posed by her birthday cake. To anyone else, it would look like a loving father celebrating his daughter's special day. But Sarah could now see the tension in her own small body, the way she leaned away from her father even while being held against him. The barely concealed fear in her eyes despite her forced smile. That photograph triggered Sarah's first major flashback since beginning therapy. Suddenly, she was 10 years old again, smelling her father's cologne, feeling his hands where they shouldn't be, hearing his voice telling her how special she was, how this was their secret, how no one would understand their special relationship. The emotional and physical sensations were so intense that Sarah vomited and then spent 2 hours in her bathroom, shaking and crying. When the flashback finally subsided, Sarah called the crisis line Dr. Chen had given her. The counselor who answered helped her process what had happened and reminded her that flashbacks, while terrifying, were actually a sign that her mind was finally allowing suppressed memories to surface for healing. Sarah scheduled an emergency session with Dr. Chen for the next day. During that session, Dr. Chen helped Sarah understand that flashbacks were a normal part of trauma recovery. Your mind protected you by suppressing many of the details of your abuse, she explained. Now that you're in a safe place and ready to heal, those memories are surfacing. It's like lancing an infected wound, painful but necessary for healing. They worked together to develop strategies for managing flashbacks when they occurred. Sarah learned breathing techniques, grounding exercises, and ways to remind herself that she was safe in the present moment. Dr. Chen also introduced the concept of EMDR therapy, a specialized treatment for trauma that could help reduce the emotional intensity of traumatic memories. As Sarah's therapy continued over the following weeks, she began to piece together a more complete picture of her childhood trauma. The abuse hadn't been isolated incidents, but a systematic pattern of grooming and exploitation that had lasted for nearly a decade. Her father had been skilled at maintaining his public image while privately destroying his daughter's sense of safety and self-worth. One of the most difficult aspects of Sarah's healing journey was beginning to understand how the abuse had affected her relationships with other family members. Her mother, Maria, had been emotionally absent during Sarah's childhood, consumed with her own struggles with depression and anxiety. Sarah began to wonder if her mother had suspected something was wrong, but had been unable or unwilling to protect her. Her older brother, Marcus, had been the golden child who could do no wrong in their father's eyes. Sarah realized that she had felt jealous of Marcus's relationship with their father, while simultaneously feeling guilty for wishing she could have that same easy, uncomplicated connection. Her sister, Isabella, was only 2 years older than Sarah, but had seemed oblivious to what was happening. Sarah had often wondered why Isabella appeared to be safe from their father's attention, and that wondering had created a complicated mix of relief and resentment. The most challenging revelation came when Sarah began to remember times when she had tried to tell people what was happening. She recalled mentioning to a teacher that her father made her uncomfortable, only to be told that she was lucky to have such a caring father who was so involved in her life. She remembered telling her mother that she didn't want to be alone with her father anymore, and her mother responding with irritation, saying that Sarah was being difficult and ungrateful. These recovered memories helped Sarah understand why she had eventually stopped trying to seek help. The adults around her had either dismissed her concerns or interpreted them as typical childhood complaints about parental authority. Her father's sterling reputation in the community had made him above suspicion, and Sarah's attempts to communicate her distress had been reframed as behavioral problems or adolescent rebellion. Chen helped Sarah process the deep sense of betrayal she felt toward the adults who should have protected her but instead had unknowingly colluded with her abuser. Children are biologically programmed to trust the adults in their lives, Dr. Chen explained. When that trust is violated, it creates profound confusion and self-doubt. You learn that your perceptions couldn't be trusted, that your safety didn't matter, and that speaking up about problems only created more problems. These are devastating lessons for a child to learn. As Sarah's therapy progressed, she began to experience what Dr. Chen called trauma bursts, periods when suppressed emotions would surface with overwhelming intensity. She might be doing something completely ordinary, like grocery shopping or studying for an exam, when suddenly she would be flooded with rage, grief, or terror connected to her childhood experiences. During one particularly intense session, Sarah expressed anger toward herself for not fighting back harder, for not finding a way to stop the abuse, for not protecting herself better. Dr. Chen helped her understand that these self-blame patterns were common among survivors but fundamentally misplaced. "Sarah, you are a child," Dr. Chen reminded her firmly. "Children are not responsible for protecting themselves from adult predators. Your father was bigger, stronger, and in a position of absolute authority over you. He used psychological manipulation, threats, and your natural love and trust to maintain control. You survived by adapting to an impossible situation. That's not a failure. That's remarkable resilience." This concept of resilience became a cornerstone of Sarah's healing journey. Instead of focusing on what she had lost or how she had been damaged, Dr. Chen helped her recognize the incredible strength it had taken to survive her childhood and build a functional adult life despite receiving no help or support. Sarah began to see her hypervigilance not just as a trauma symptom, but as evidence of her determination to stay safe. Her difficulty with intimacy wasn't just a problem to solve, but also a protective mechanism that had served an important purpose. About 2 months into her therapy, Sarah reached a crucial decision point. Dr. Topan Davida Chen had been gently suggesting that Sarah consider whether she wanted to have any contact with her family about her memories and healing journey. Sarah had been adamant that she couldn't and wouldn't tell anyone, that the risk of destroying her family was too great. But as she continued to heal and gain clarity about her experiences, Sarah began to feel differently about protecting her father's reputation at the expense of her own well-being. She started to consider the possibility that her silence might be enabling him to continue harming others. She also began to wonder about her siblings' experiences and whether they might have their own stories of abuse or inappropriate behavior. The turning point came when Sarah received a phone call from her sister Isabella. It was unusual for Isabella to call. Their communication was typically limited to brief exchanges on birthdays and holidays. But Isabella sounded distressed and said she needed to talk to someone about their father. "Sarah, I know this might sound crazy, but I've been having these dreams lately," Isabella began hesitantly. "They feel like memories, but I can't tell if they're real or if I'm losing my mind. They're about Dad and things that happened when I was little. I keep waking up feeling sick and scared, and I don't know what to do." Sarah's heart began racing as she listened to her sister describe experiences that sounded remarkably similar to her own recovered memories. Isabella spoke about feeling confused and scared around their father, about incidents that felt wrong but that she couldn't quite remember clearly, about a persistent sense that something terrible had happened to her that she couldn't quite access. For a moment, Sarah considered deflecting, changing the subject, or suggesting that Isabella was simply having stress-induced nightmares. It would have been so much easier to maintain the status quo, to keep her own healing journey separate from her family's continued dysfunction. But as she listened to her sister's distress, Sarah realized that her silence was no longer just about protecting herself. It was potentially leaving another victim isolated and confused. Taking the deepest breath of her life, Sarah made a choice that would change everything for both sisters. "Isabella," she said quietly, "I don't think you're losing your mind. I think you might be remembering things that actually happened, and I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and covered 20 years of suppressed memories, confused feelings, and shared experiences that neither sister had ever dared to name. Isabella's memories were more fragmented than Sarah's, occurring when she was younger and involving less severe abuse, but the pattern was unmistakably similar. Their father had violated both daughters, using his authority and their trust to satisfy his own twisted needs. As the sisters shared their stories, they began to understand how their father had operated. He had been careful to isolate each victim, ensuring that neither sister knew about the other's abuse. He had used different tactics with each daughter, tailored to their personalities and ages. With Sarah, he had emphasized the special relationship and threats about family consequences. With Isabella, he had relied more on confusion and gaslighting, making her doubt her own perceptions and memories. By the end of their conversation, both sisters were emotionally exhausted but also profoundly relieved. For the first time in their lives, they weren't alone with their terrible secret. They had each other, and they had validation that their memories and feelings were real and justified. Isabella agreed to begin therapy with her own trauma specialist, and the sisters made plans to support each other through their healing journeys. They also began to discuss the difficult question of what, if anything, to do about their father. Sarah shared information about statutes of limitations, about the possibility of other victims, and about the complex legal and emotional considerations involved in reporting childhood sexual abuse. But even as Sarah felt grateful for the connection with her sister, she also felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were facing. Their shared revelation meant that their father's abuse wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that had harmed multiple victims within their own family. It raised questions about their mother's knowledge or suspicions, about their brother's experiences, and about potential victims outside their immediate family. Sarah's therapy sessions with Dr. Chen took on new intensity as she processed not only her own trauma, but also the guilt and responsibility she felt toward her sister. She struggled with questions about whether she could have protected Isabella if she had spoken up sooner, whether her silence had enabled continued abuse, and whether she was now obligated to take action that might have far-reaching consequences for her entire extended family. Chen helped Sarah understand that these feelings of responsibility were both natural and misplaced. You were a child when this abuse occurred, and you were a young adult struggling with your own trauma recovery when you made decisions about disclosure. Dr. Chen reminded her, "You cannot be held responsible for your father's choices or for protecting other potential victims when you were barely managing to survive yourself." As Sarah's second month of therapy concluded, she found herself at another crossroads. The revelation of her sister's abuse had confirmed that their father was a serial predator, not someone who had made isolated mistakes or poor choices. This knowledge brought with it both validation and tremendous burden. Sarah now faced decisions about legal action, family confrontation, and public disclosure that felt far more complex than anything she had anticipated when she first walked into Dr. Chen's office. But Sarah was no longer the same person who had collapsed in a diner just 2 months earlier. She was stronger, more self-aware, and most importantly, no longer alone. Whatever decisions lay ahead, she would face them with professional support, therapeutic tools, and the solidarity of her sister who shared her experience and her determination to heal. The journey from victim to survivor was proving to be more complicated and challenging than Sarah had ever imagined, but it was also revealing depths of strength and resilience she had never known she possessed. As she prepared for what might be the most difficult phase of her healing journey, Sarah finally understood that speaking her truth hadn't destroyed her. It had begun to set her free. The decision to confront their father came 6 weeks after Sarah and Isabella first shared their stories with each other. Both sisters had been working individually with their therapists, processing not only their childhood trauma, but also the complex emotions surrounding their recent revelations. Dr. Valentine had not been evaluated to see Judge Ethan Tua. Chen had been helping Sarah prepare for this possibility, knowing that many survivors eventually reach a point where maintaining silence becomes more painful than speaking their truth. The confrontation was planned carefully, with both Dr. Chen and Isabella's therapist, Dr. Martinez, providing guidance on safety protocols and emotional preparation. They would meet their father in a public place, have exit strategies prepared, and maintain contact with their therapists immediately before and after the encounter. Most importantly, they agreed that their primary goal wasn't to get their father to admit wrongdoing or apologize, but simply to break their own silence and reclaim their voices. Robert Martinez agreed to meet his daughters for lunch at a chain restaurant halfway between Oceanside and his home in Nevada. He seemed pleased to hear from both girls, commenting that it had been too long since they had all been together. Sarah felt sick listening to his cheerful paternal tone, knowing what she was about to reveal. The man who sounded so normal and loving on the phone was the same person who had stolen their childhoods and damaged their ability to trust. Isabella drove down from her home in Los Angeles, and the sisters met at Sarah's apartment the night before their planned confrontation. They stayed up until nearly dawn, rehearsing what they wanted to say, supporting each other through panic attacks and moments of doubt, and reminding themselves why this conversation was necessary for their healing. What if he denies everything? Isabella asked for the 10th time that night. What if he makes us feel crazy or like we're making it all up? Sarah had wrestled with the same fears, but her months of therapy had given her tools to handle these possibilities. "Isabella, we're not doing this to convince him of anything or to get him to validate our experiences," she reminded her sister. "We're doing this because we deserve to speak our truth. Whether he admits it or denies it doesn't change what happened to us." The restaurant was crowded with the lunch rush when they arrived, and Sarah was grateful for the noise and activity that would provide cover for what promised to be an emotionally charged conversation. Their father was already seated in a corner booth, wearing the same warm smile Sarah remembered from family gatherings. For a moment, she felt the familiar confusion that had plagued her childhood, How could someone who looked so normal and caring have done such terrible things? Robert Martinez stood to embrace both daughters, and Sarah's body reacted with the same tension Thompson had noticed in the hospital months earlier. Her father seemed oblivious to her discomfort, chatting cheerfully about their drive, the weather, and his pride in their academic and professional accomplishments. To any observer, they would have looked like a loving father enjoying lunch with his successful daughters. Sarah and Isabella had agreed that Sarah would lead the conversation, since she had been in therapy longer and had more complete memories of the abuse. After they ordered their food and exchanged some basic pleasantries, Sarah took a deep breath and began. Dad, Isabella and I asked you to meet with us because we need to talk about some things that happened when we were children, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she had expected. Things that happened between you and each of us that were inappropriate and harmful. The change in their father's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His smile vanished, his posture stiffened, and his eyes took on a sharp, calculating look that Sarah remembered from her childhood. This was the man who had threatened and manipulated her, not the jovial father he portrayed in public. I don't know what you're talking about, he said quickly, his voice defensive. If someone has been filling your heads with nonsense about false memories or some kind of therapy-induced fantasies, you need to know the kind of thing has been debunked. Daughters who make accusations like this usually have mental health issues or substance abuse problems. Sarah felt her anger rising at his immediate shift to attack mode, but she also felt a strange sense of validation. His response confirmed what Dr. Mo Chen had warned her about, that predators often react to exposure with denial, deflection, and attempts to discredit their victims. The fact that he immediately knew exactly what type of accusations they were making, despite her vague introduction, was telling. Dad, we're not talking about false memories, Isabella said, her voice shaking but determined. We're talking about real things that happened to us, real things that you did to us when we were children who trusted you. Over the next hour, both sisters shared specific details of their abuse. They described incidents, locations, things their father had said, ways he had manipulated and threatened them. With each revelation, Robert Martinez's denials became more aggressive and his attempts at manipulation more desperate. He tried several different tactics, clearly following a playbook he had developed over years of hiding his crimes. First, he claimed complete ignorance, suggesting that the sisters were confused or mentally ill. When that didn't work, he shifted to minimization, suggesting that any physical contact had been normal parental affection misinterpreted by overly sensitive children. As the sisters provided more specific details, he began to attack their credibility, bringing up Sarah's recent hospitalization and questioning Isabella's history of anxiety and depression. You girls have always been dramatic, he said, his voice taking on the condescending tone Sarah remembered so well. Sarah, you just had some kind of breakdown and ended up in the hospital. Isabella, you've been seeing therapists for years for your anxiety. Now you're both in therapy together, probably feeding off each other's problems and creating false memories. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when unstable people get together and start imagining things. But Sarah was no longer the frightened child who had been silenced by her father's manipulations. Months of therapy had taught her to recognize these tactics for what they were, and she had prepared for exactly this type of response. Dad, the reason I was hospitalized is because I've been carrying the trauma of what you did to me for 15 years, Sarah said firmly. The reason Isabella has anxiety is because she's been trying to process memories of abuse that she couldn't fully remember until recently. We're not creating false memories. We're finally able to talk about real experiences that you taught us to keep secret. The confrontation continued for another 30 minutes, with Robert Martinez cycling through various defensive strategies. He claimed that he couldn't be guilty because he had never been accused before, ignoring the obvious fact that both daughters had been too frightened and manipulated to speak up previously. He suggested that their mother would verify his innocence, not knowing that both sisters were already planning to have a separate conversation with her. He even attempted to use religion as a shield, pointing out his active involvement in their church and asking how his daughters could make such accusations against someone who had devoted his life to serving God and the community. This particular manipulation triggered intense anger in both sisters, who remembered how their father had used their religious upbringing to increase their shame and silence. You taught us that God was always watching, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You made us believe that we were somehow dirty or sinful because of what you did to us. You used our faith as another way to control us and keep us quiet. But God knows what you did. And so do we. As the confrontation reached its climax, Robert Martinez made one final attempt at manipulation that revealed the calculating nature of his abuse. He began to cry, claiming that he was heartbroken that his daughters would hurt him this way, that he had always loved them and would never harm them. He spoke about his reputation in the community, his career, and the impact these accusations would have on the family if they became public. "Think about your mother," he pleaded. "Think about your brother. Think about our extended family and everyone who knows us. Do you really want to destroy all of that based on some confused memories and therapy-induced fantasies? I love you, girls. I've always loved you. I would never hurt you. You have to know that." Sarah looked at her father, crying and begging, and felt no sympathy for his distress. This was the same man who had shown no concern for her pain when she was 8 years old and confused about why her father was touching her inappropriately. This was the person who had threatened to hurt other family members if she spoke up, who had made her believe that her safety and well-being were less important than his reputation and comfort. "Dad, you did hurt us," Sarah said with finality. "You hurt us repeatedly, systematically, and deliberately. You taught us that our pain didn't matter, that your needs were more important than our safety, and that protecting your image was more important than protecting us. We're not confused about what happened, and we're not going to be manipulated into staying silent anymore." The sisters left the restaurant without eating their food, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely empowered. They had faced their abuser, spoken their truth, and refused to be silenced or discredited. Robert Martinez's response had been predictable and confirming. He had shown no genuine remorse, no concern for the pain he had caused, and no acknowledgement that his actions had been harmful. Over the following days, both sisters experienced a complex mix of emotions. There was relief at finally breaking their silence with the person who had harmed them, but also grief for the father they had never really had. They felt angry at his continued manipulation and denial, but also strangely freed from the hope that he might someday acknowledge what he had done and apologize. Dr. Chen helped Sarah process the confrontation and its aftermath during their sessions. "Sarah, you spoke your truth to someone who spent years teaching you that your truth didn't matter," Dr. Chen observed. "That took incredible courage, and it was an important step in reclaiming your voice and your power." But the confrontation with their father was only the beginning of the difficult conversations the sisters would need to have. They had agreed that their next step would be talking to their mother, Maria Martinez, a conversation that felt equally challenging for different reasons. Sarah and Isabella had complicated relationships with their mother. Maria had been present during their childhoods but emotionally unavailable in ways that had left both daughters feeling unsupported and misunderstood. She had struggled with depression and anxiety throughout their childhood, often leaving the girls to manage their own emotional needs while she dealt with her own mental health challenges. Both sisters wondered what their mother had known or suspected about their father's abuse. There had been times when Sarah thought she had tried to tell her mother indirectly about feeling uncomfortable around her father, but these attempts had been dismissed or reframed as typical family friction. Isabella had similar memories of trying to communicate distress that went unheard or unaddressed. The conversation with their mother took place 2 weeks after the confrontation with their father. Maria agreed to meet them at Isabella's apartment in Los Angeles, saying she was concerned about the recent tension she sensed in the family. Robert had apparently told her that the girls were going through some kind of emotional crisis and making unfounded accusations, but he had asked her not to discuss it with them directly. Maria Martinez was a small, soft-spoken woman who had always seemed fragile to her daughters. As she sat in Isabella's living room, she appeared nervous and uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with whatever conversation was about to take place. Sarah and Isabella had agreed to approach this conversation differently than they had with their father, leading with compassion while still maintaining clear boundaries about their need to be heard and believed. "Mom, we asked you to come here because we need to share some information with you about Dad, and some things that happened to us when we were children," Sarah began gently. "This is going to be difficult to hear, but we need you to know the truth about what our childhood was really like." Maria's immediate response was defensive, but in a different way than their father's had been. Where Robert had been aggressive and manipulative, Maria seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to disappear from the conversation entirely. "I don't want to hear anything bad about your father," she said quietly. "He's a good man, and he's been good to this family. Whatever problems you girls think you remember, they're probably just misunderstandings or normal family issues that got blown out of proportion." Isabella tried a different approach. Mum, we're not asking you to choose sides or make any decisions about Dad. We're just asking you to listen to us and try to understand what we experienced. You're our mother, and we need you to hear us." Over the next 2 hours, the sisters shared their stories with their mother, watching her face grow pale as they described years of systematic abuse. Maria's responses cycled through various stages of denial, shock, and what appeared to be a dawning recognition of signs she had missed or ignored. As the sisters provided more details, Maria began to remember incidents that had seemed odd or concerning at the time, but that she had rationalized or dismissed. She recalled times when Sarah had seemed unusually clingy and anxious, periods when Isabella had nightmares and became afraid to sleep alone, occasions when both girls had seemed uncomfortable around their father in ways that Maria had attributed to normal adolescent moodiness. "I asked you once if Dad had ever touched you inappropriately," Maria said to Sarah, her voice barely a whisper. "You were about 14, and you seemed so anxious and angry all the time. But you said no, everything was fine. I believed you because I wanted to believe you. I needed to believe you." Sarah remembered that conversation, and she understood now why she had been unable to tell her mother the truth at that time. By age 14, she had learned that adults either couldn't or wouldn't protect her from her father. She had also absorbed her father's messages about the consequences of disclosure, believing that revealing the truth would destroy her family and hurt people she loved. "Mum, I couldn't tell you then because I was afraid," Sarah explained. "Dad had convinced me that telling would hurt you and everyone else in the family. He made me believe that keeping his secret was the only way to protect the people I loved. I was a child, and I was scared and confused." As the conversation continued, Maria began to reveal her own struggles during the years when the abuse was occurring. She had been dealing with severe depression and anxiety, often feeling overwhelmed by the basic responsibilities of parenting and marriage. She had relied heavily on her husband to handle many aspects of child rearing, trusting him to be appropriate and protective with their daughters. "I was so sick during those years," Maria admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I could barely take care of myself, let alone pay attention to what was happening with you girls. I trusted your father completely. I thought he was the strong one, the one who could handle everything I couldn't. I never imagined, I never thought." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she listened to her mother's explanations. Part of her felt compassion for a woman who had clearly been struggling with her own mental health challenges. But part of her also felt angry that her mother's illness had created an environment where predatory behavior could flourish unchecked. Dr. Chen had prepared Sarah for this possibility, explaining that in families where abuse occurs, there are often multiple layers of dysfunction that enable the abuse to continue. "Your mother's depression didn't cause your father's abuse," Dr. Chen had explained, "but it may have created circumstances that made it easier for him to access victims and avoid detection." Isabella seemed to be processing similar emotions as she listened to their mother describe her mental health struggles during their childhood. "Mum, we understand that you were dealing with your own problems," Isabella said carefully, "but we were children who needed protection. We needed you to see what was happening and help us, even if you were struggling with depression." This statement seemed to break something open in Maria Martinez. She began crying more intensely, speaking about her guilt and regret over not being more present and protective during her daughter's childhoods. She talked about signs she had noticed but dismissed, concerns she had rationalized away, and instincts she had ignored because facing the truth would have been too overwhelming. "I failed you," she said through her tears. "I was your mother, and I was supposed to protect you, and I failed. I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how to forgive myself for not seeing what was right in front of me." The conversation with their mother continued for several more hours, covering not only the abuse itself but also its ongoing impact on the entire family. Maria learned about her daughter's struggles with relationships, their difficulty trusting others, their physical and emotional symptoms, and their current therapy processes. Unlike their father, Maria showed genuine remorse and concern for her daughter's pain. She asked what she could do to support their healing, whether there were ways to repair their relationship, and how she could help them feel safe and supported going forward. She also began to grapple with the implications of their revelations for her own marriage and future. "What am I supposed to do now?" Maria asked. "How am I supposed to live with someone who did these things to my daughters? How am I supposed to pretend everything is normal when I know what he's capable of?" Sarah and Isabella had discussed this possibility with their therapists, knowing that their disclosures might precipitate their parents' separation or divorce. While they didn't want to be responsible for breaking up their parents' marriage, they also recognized that their mother deserved to know the truth about the man she had been married to for over 30 years. "Mom, we can't tell you what to do about your marriage," Sarah said gently. "But you deserve to make informed decisions about your life based on accurate information about who Dad really is." "We're not asking you to choose between us and him, but we are asking you to believe us and to prioritize everyone's safety going forward." The conversation concluded with Maria promising to support her daughter's healing process and to consider her own options regarding her marriage. She also asked if there might be other victims, expressing concern about her husband's access to children through his work and community involvement. This question validated the sisters' own concerns about their father's potential to harm others. In the weeks following their conversation with their mother, Sarah and Isabella watched their parents' marriage begin to unravel. Maria moved into the guest bedroom and began asking Robert direct questions about the allegations. She also started her own therapy process, working with a counselor who specialized in helping family members of abuse survivors. Robert's response to his wife's newfound awareness was predictably manipulative. He accused the daughters of poisoning their mother against him, claimed that Maria's belief in their false accusations proved she was mentally unstable, and threatened to divorce her if she continued to support what he called their malicious lies. But Maria Martinez was no longer the same fragile woman who had been unable to protect her daughters years earlier. Her own therapy was helping her understand the dynamics of abuse and manipulation, and she was beginning to recognize patterns in her husband's behavior that extended far beyond his treatment of their daughters. She noticed how he controlled conversations, dismissed her concerns, and used emotional manipulation to maintain power in their relationship. 3 months after Sarah and Isabella's disclosure, Maria Martinez filed for separation from her husband of 32 years. They worried about burdening him with information that might be devastating, but they also recognized that he deserved to know the truth about his father's character. Additionally, they wondered about Marcus's own childhood experiences and whether he might have been victimized in ways he hadn't recognized or remembered. This decision would mark the next phase of their healing journey, as they grappled with questions about extending their circle of disclosure, protecting other potential victims, and dealing with the complex reactions of family members who were unprepared for the truth about Robert Martinez's secret life. The decision to tell Marcus came after Sarah received a disturbing phone call from her father. It was 3 months after their confrontation, and Robert Martinez was becoming increasingly desperate as his carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. His wife had left him, his daughters were no longer speaking to him, and he was facing the possibility that their accusations might become public knowledge. "Sarah, you need to stop this nonsense before it destroys our entire family." Her father's voice was cold and threatening, more reminiscent of the man from her childhood than the public persona he usually maintained. "I've been patient with you and Isabella, understanding that you're both going through some kind of mental health crisis, but this has gone too far. Your mother is talking about divorce, and if these ridiculous accusations become public, they'll ruin everything I've worked for." Sarah felt her body respond with familiar fear reactions, rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, the urge to flee or appease. But months of therapy had given her tools to manage these responses and maintain her clarity of thought. "Dad, the only person who destroyed our family is you," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "What you did to Isabella and me when we were children is the problem, not our decision to finally speak about it. We're not going to be silent anymore to protect your reputation." Her father's response was swift and vicious. "If you and your sister continue with this fantasy, I'll make sure everyone knows about your mental health problems. I'll tell them about your hospitalization, about Isabella's anxiety issues, about how both of you have been unstable for years. I have friends in the medical community who will testify about false memory syndrome and how therapy can implant suggestions in unstable minds. I'll destroy your credibility in your careers before I let you destroy mine." The call lasted only a few more minutes, but it crystallized several important realizations for Sarah. First, her father's threats proved that he was far more concerned about protecting his reputation than addressing the harm he had caused his daughters. Second, his willingness to attack their mental health and professional standing showed that he viewed them as enemies to be neutralized, rather than children he had wounded. Most importantly, his desperation suggested that he was afraid their accusations might become public, which implied there might be other victims or witnesses who could corroborate their stories. After consulting with Dr. Chan about the threatening phone call, Sarah made the difficult decision to contact her brother Marcus. She and Isabella agreed that he needed to know the truth, both for his own safety and because their father's escalating behavior suggested he might try to manipulate Marcus into taking sides in what he was framing as a family conflict driven by his daughter's mental instability. Marcus Martinez was 2 years older than Sarah and had always been their father's pride and joy. He had followed his father into education, working as a high school math teacher and coach in Oregon. Marcus had married his college sweetheart, had 2 young children, and maintained the kind of stable, successful life that their father constantly held up as an example for his sisters to follow. Sarah's phone call to Marcus was one of the most difficult conversations of her life. She began by explaining that there was something serious happening in their family that he needed to know about, something that would explain their parents' separation and the tension he had sensed during recent family interactions. Marcus's initial response was confusion and concern. He had noticed that family communications had become strained over the past few months, but he had attributed it to normal marital problems or midlife stress. He had no framework for understanding what Sarah was about to tell him. "Marcus, I need to share something with you about Dad that's going to be very difficult to hear," Sarah began, her voice careful and gentle. "Isabella and I have been in therapy dealing with some childhood trauma, and we've realized that Dad sexually abused both of us when we were children. We've recently told Mum about this, which is why they separated." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly a full minute. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, what are you saying? That's impossible. Dad would never. He's not that kind of person. He's dedicated his entire life to children and education. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding or false memory or something." Sarah had expected this response and had prepared for it with Dr. Chen's help. She understood that Marcus's entire understanding of his father and his family would need to be reconstructed if he accepted what she was telling him. She also recognized that Marcus might have his own psychological defenses that would make it difficult for him to process this information. Over the next hour, Sarah carefully shared details of her and Isabella's experiences, explaining how the abuse had occurred, how they had been manipulated into silence, and how they had finally found the courage to speak about it in therapy. She also shared information about their confrontation with their father and his complete denial and threats. As Sarah spoke, she could hear Marcus's breathing becoming more labored, and occasionally he would make small sounds of distress or disbelief. When she finished sharing the basic facts, Marcus was quiet for a long time before responding. "Sarah, I don't know what to think. This changes everything about our family, about my childhood, about Dad. I mean, when you're saying is true, then I've been wrong about him my entire life, but it's so hard to believe that someone I've looked up to and respected could be capable of something so horrible." Sarah understood Marcus's struggle and didn't push him to immediately accept or respond to her revelations. Instead, she focused on providing him with information and resources, including contact information for therapists who specialized in helping family members process these kinds of disclosures. But Marcus had questions that went beyond his own emotional processing. "Sarah, if Dad did these things to you and Isabella, what about me? I mean, I was around him too. Did he ever?" This was a question Sarah had been dreading but had known was inevitable. She and Isabella had wondered about Marcus's experiences, but had been reluctant to suggest that he might also be a victim without more evidence. Sexual abuse of male children by their fathers was often even more difficult to remember and disclose due to additional layers of shame and confusion about masculinity and sexual identity. "Marcus, I honestly don't know," Sarah replied carefully. "Isabella and I have talked about whether you might have had experiences similar to ours, but we didn't want to suggest something that might not be true. All I can tell you is that if you have any memories or feelings or questions about your own childhood experiences with Dad, it might be worth talking to someone trained in trauma therapy." The suggestion clearly disturbed Marcus deeply. Sarah could hear him struggling with concepts and possibilities he had never considered before. For several minutes he said nothing, and Sarah wondered if the conversation had been too overwhelming, and he had simply put the phone down. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice shaky and uncertain. "Sarah, there are some things, some memories I've never really understood. Times when I felt uncomfortable around Dad, or confused about things that happened. I always told myself I was being weird or oversensitive, but now, God, I don't know. Maybe I need to think about this more seriously." This admission confirmed Sarah's worst fears. while also validating the importance of telling Marcus the truth. If their father had victimized all three children, the pattern of abuse was even more extensive and systematic than they had realized. It also meant that Marcus might be dealing with his own unprocessed trauma that could be affecting his adult life and relationships. Over the following weeks, Marcus began his own journey of questioning childhood memories and experiences he had previously dismissed or rationalized. He started therapy with a counselor who specialized in male survivors of childhood sexual abuse and slowly began to recover memories and recognize patterns that he had spent years suppressing. Marcus's revelations were different from his sister's but followed similar patterns of grooming, boundary violation, and psychological manipulation. His father had been more subtle in his approach with Marcus, using activities like camping trips and sports training as opportunities for inappropriate contact. He had also used Marcus's desire to please and excel to create situations where the boy felt obligated to accept uncomfortable physical contact as part of their special father-son relationship. The recovery of these memories was devastating for Marcus, who had built his entire adult identity around being the successful son who had made his father proud. Learning that his relationship with his father had been based on manipulation and abuse rather than genuine love and respect shattered fundamental assumptions about himself and his family. Marcus's wife Jennifer had always wondered about certain aspects of her husband's relationship with his father. She had noticed that Marcus seemed anxious and people-pleasing around his father, and that he had difficulty setting boundaries with him. She had also observed that Marcus sometimes seemed uncomfortable with physical affection and had periods of depression and anxiety that he attributed to work stress, but that seemed disproportionate to his actual circumstances. When Marcus finally told Jennifer about his recovered memories and his sister's revelations, many puzzle pieces fell into place for her. She immediately supported his decision to cut contact with his father and begin intensive therapy. Jennifer also reached out to Sarah and Isabella, thanking them for their courage in speaking up and acknowledging that their disclosure had probably saved her husband years of continued confusion and self-doubt. The revelation that Robert Martinez had abused all three of his children transformed the family dynamic completely. Sarah, Isabella, and Marcus began supporting each other through their healing processes, sharing resources, validating each other's experiences, and working together to understand the full scope of their father's predatory behavior. They also began to consider more seriously the possibility that there might be other victims outside their immediate family. Robert Martinez had spent his entire career working with children and adolescents as a high school principal. He had been involved in numerous community organizations, coached sports teams, and mentored young people throughout their community. His position of authority and trust had given him access to countless potential victims over the decades. The siblings faced a difficult decision about whether to report their father to law enforcement. Sarah consulted with a prosecutor who specialized in historical child abuse cases and learned that while the statute of limitations had expired for their own abuse, their testimony could potentially be used as evidence if other victims came forward with more recent allegations. They also learned that school districts and licensing boards took these allegations seriously, even when criminal prosecution wasn't possible. A report to the state education department could result in Robert Martinez losing his teaching credential and being prohibited from working with children in the future. The decision to make formal reports was agonizing for all three siblings. They knew that going public with their allegations would invite scrutiny, skepticism, and potentially legal retaliation from their father. They also worried about the impact on their extended family, their father's colleagues, and the community that had trusted and respected him for so many years. But their therapy had helped them understand that their primary obligation was to their own healing and to the protection of other potential victims. Chen had been clear with Sarah that survivors who choose to report their abuse often find the process empowering, even when it doesn't result in criminal convictions. Sarah, speaking your truth publicly is a powerful act of reclaiming your voice and your agency, Dr. Chen explained. Whatever the outcome, you'll know that you did everything possible to protect other children and hold your father accountable for his actions. After months of preparation and consultation with their therapists and legal advisors, the three siblings decided to move forward with formal reports. Sarah filed a complaint with the state licensing board, Isabella reported to the county social services department, and Marcus contacted the police department in their hometown to create an official record of their allegations. The process of making these reports was both empowering and re-traumatizing. Each sibling had to provide detailed statements about their abuse, submit to interviews with investigators, and prepare for the possibility that their father might challenge their credibility or file countersuits claiming defamation. Robert Martinez's response to the official reports was swift and predictable. He hired an attorney and began a campaign to discredit his children's allegations. He claimed they were engaged in a conspiracy motivated by financial gain, mental illness, and manipulation by unethical therapists. He pointed to his sterling reputation in the community, his decades of service to children, and the lack of any previous complaints against him. But his defensive strategy backfired in ways he hadn't anticipated. The very vehemence of his denials and attacks on his children's credibility raised questions among people who had known the family. Several community members began to recall incidents or behaviors that had seemed odd at the time but that they had rationalized or dismissed. They faced social media attacks from people who still believed in their father's innocence, legal complications as their father's attorney tried to discredit them, and emotional exhaustion from repeatedly telling their stories to investigators, reporters, and court officials. But they also experienced unprecedented support from their community, their extended family, and other survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Their mother, Maria, publicly supported their allegations and filed for divorce from her husband of over 30 years. Their aunts, uncles, and cousins rallied around them, expressing pride in their courage and offering whatever support they could provide. Most importantly, the siblings began to experience the kind of healing that comes from living authentically and refusing to carry shame that belongs to someone else. Sarah's physical health improved dramatically as her body finally began to release decades of stored trauma. Isabella's anxiety decreased significantly as she stopped expending energy on maintaining secrets and managing family dysfunction. Marcus began to understand himself and his relationships more clearly, leading to improved intimacy with his wife and better emotional availability for his children. Dr. Chen observed remarkable changes in Sarah during this period. "Sarah, you've transformed from someone who was barely surviving her trauma to someone who is actively thriving despite it," she noted during one of their sessions. "You've found your voice, established your boundaries, and refused to let your father's actions define your worth or limit your possibilities." The legal proceedings against Robert Martinez were complex and drawn out, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. While the criminal statute of limitations had expired for most of the allegations, the licensing board moved forward with their investigation and ultimately revoked his teaching credential permanently. The civil statute of limitations allowed some victims to pursue financial compensation for their damages. But for Sarah, Isabella, and Marcus, the most important outcome wasn't legal or financial. It was the knowledge that they had broken the cycle of silence that had protected their father and potentially enabled him to harm other children. They had transformed from isolated victims into empowered survivors who had found their voices and used them to protect others. The journey from that night in the hospital when Thompson first recognized Sarah's trauma responses to the public vindication of their allegations had taken nearly 2 years. It had required tremendous courage, professional support, family solidarity, and community backing. Most importantly, it had required the 3 siblings to believe that their truth was more important than their father's reputation, that their healing was more valuable than their family's secrets, and that their voices deserved to be heard regardless of how uncomfortable their message made others feel. As Sarah reflected on everything that had transpired, she felt grateful for Thompson's recognition of her trauma symptoms that night in the hospital. Without his trained eye and compassionate intervention, she might have continued carrying her secrets for many more years. His willingness to see beyond her physical symptoms to the deeper wounds she carried had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to justice, healing, and protection for other potential victims. 2 years after that pivotal night in the Oceanside Hospital, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Child Trauma and Recovery. She had been invited to speak about her experience as a survivor who had found her voice and helped expose a serial predator. The journey from that collapsed figure on a diner floor to this confident woman addressing fellow professionals seemed almost impossible to believe, but every step had been hard-earned and authentic. The case against Robert Martinez had concluded 6 months earlier with a settlement that required him to register as a sex offender and accept a lifetime ban from working with children in any capacity. While criminal charges couldn't be pursued due to statutes of limitations, the civil proceedings had resulted in financial compensation for all 6 confirmed victims and had created a permanent legal record of his crimes. But the legal resolution was only one aspect of the healing that had taken place. The Martinez siblings had each traveled their own difficult but ultimately transformative paths toward recovery and empowerment. Sarah had completed her nursing degree and had chosen to specialize in pediatric emergency medicine, finding profound meaning in her ability to recognize and respond to signs of abuse and trauma in young patients. Her experience had given her unique insight into the ways trauma manifests physically, and she had become an advocate for trauma-informed care in medical settings. Her relationship with David Thompson, the SEAL corpsman who had first recognized her trauma responses, had evolved into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping trauma survivors. Thompson had often reflected on how his military training in recognizing combat trauma had translated into civilian healthcare, and he frequently spoke at conferences about the importance of understanding how past trauma affects present health. Sarah's case changed how I approach every patient, Thompson often said in his presentations. When someone's body is telling you a story that doesn't match their words, you have to be willing to listen to both. Sometimes recognizing trauma isn't about dramatic symptoms. It's about paying attention to the subtle ways people protect themselves from perceived threats. Isabella had relocated to be closer to her siblings and had changed careers entirely, leaving her corporate marketing job to become a victim advocate. She worked with a non-profit organization that provided support services to survivors of childhood sexual abuse, helping them navigate legal processes, access therapy, and find their voices. Her own experience as a survivor who had recovered fragmented memories made her particularly effective at helping other clients who struggled with unclear or incomplete recollections of their abuse.